Okay, everybody, sorry for the interruption. We had a little bit go on that interrupted, but I wanted to get into this.
And I find that exciting. So what we're hearing is that in the spring, they liked 10,000 gold and 400 silver. Now they like 15,000 gold and 700 silver. And I've got some pretty interesting things that are going to show up in the October newsletter regarding, various prices. But
so friends, please visit patreon.com/Beyond Mystic. Insider access will be providing explosive content that YouTube will deny you access to. Many of my guests are notorious for giving you explosive contents, whether that be for your health, for your prosperity, and for your enlightenment. So along with all today's banned videos, please visit patreon.com/Beyond Mystic and subscribe to my Insider Access Pass today.
All right, I think that's over. So, kind of going into the details there.
Hello, I'm Danielle DiMartino Booth, and you are watching Down the Middle with DiMartino Booth. I'm so pleased today to have with me Brigadier General Robert Spalding. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, but he has also just started a new venture. He is the founder of Q Networks, and we're going to start off by asking him what he's doing with that, what that is, what the future is, and then we'll go all the way back to where it started.
Thank you. It's good to be here. So Q Networks is really an extension of what I was doing at the White House. I did an infamous study on 5G that was leaked to the media on behalf of the telecom industry, so thank you, telecom industry. And is really calling for a nationwide secure 5G network because...
All right, so some of the details on internet and access is a social justice issue for the youth that we work for. Getting back into Chapter 13, social work with families and youth. Another thing is the issues that come up with kids not being as productive working on those all the time. So here's a list of some of the contemporary family forms. So we have both single parent families and blended families. The majority that I had worked with at Lighthouse Youth Services was single families. Sometimes you would have a blended family where they had gotten remarried, and we're doing things again to start working together. Another faction on the list is gay and lesbian families. So since 2015, it has been legal to get married in the United States, same-sex marriage, whereas previous to that, it was illegal. So, worked with some of the chickens this morning, looks like. Got that on. There's also multi-generational families, and then grandparent-headed families. That was a lot of the work we had done at Miami and a grant we had written for the grandparents raising grandchildren. And that was because there are a lot of overdoses in the Hamilton County and the spaces that we have all over Ohio where there's a well-known overdose problem. So some of the family-centered services, as a social worker, you could do counseling for families, individuals, and groups. Also, family life education. That's some of the prevention work that we would do. Also, the financial assistance. And then employee assistance. Some of the EAP programs will fund something that would be in the order of 6 to 7 free counseling visits. And you find that all over Because when you work for an agency, they want you to be well and healthy. They don't want to have issues that are going on that, create family problems, because that could actually affect workers' productivity and whatnot. So one last piece you would do as a social worker is advocacy. So if you're an advocate, you may be advocating for them to have certain services, certain, in the school, advocating that they have funding for lunches and things of that nature. So some of the presenting issues you'll see, and these are what we've already gone over in class, is domestic violence, poverty, addiction, some of the way families are structured, because they're not always the exact same. Sometimes you'll have a single mom, sometimes a single dad. Sometimes you'll have those blended families, different things that, cause the issues with them in the first place. Maybe the addiction broke the family apart, and that's why they had gone away. That causes stress, and then certainly affects the communication patterns. A big one that social workers do get involved with is child maltreatment. So with Child Protective Services, that's one of the ways that we get involved, being the social worker for them. I do want to say, not all social workers take away children. I was a social worker for Lighthouse Youth Services, and we actually were in charge of trying to keep the family together. So there's different types of child abuse and neglect. One of our videos goes over that, but more specifically, it would say the neglect is one form of abuse, and then there's also sexual abuse and physical abuse. And within the incidences of child maltreatment, they do say that neglect is the highest within the United States. And some of the contributing factors could be that there is family stress, there's addiction in the family, so they don't take time to take care of their kids, they haven't taken time to take care of themselves. There's also some psychological effects of the children, and I have a few videos for that, just on what this does to the child in general. And then sexual abuse, there's different ways. As a social worker, we are a mandatory reporter, so if you see any of that stuff coming up, we are mandated to report that if we have any incidences of that. Some of the child welfare legislation, so Child Abuse and Prevention and Treatment Act. That was the first one passed, along with the Indian Child Welfare Act for Indian reservations. We've since had the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act, and then Child Abuse and Treatment Act amendments. So with the child welfare legislation, this was started in the Omnibus Reconciliation Act and Family Preservation and Family Support Services. There was also Adoption and Safe Families Act and Foster Care Independence Act. So I had one video I wanted to show you guys that was about neglect. And this is one we also use in the child development class. So as you move on to hbse, human behavior in the social environment, you'll see this video, and this is about the child neglect. So I want you guys to get some of this.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children, because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes things, and that represents serve and return is the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
There was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development. Certain key synapses, the connections between nerves fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get the double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the US. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category, called severe neglect, generally found in institutional settings, is a result of children living in kind of warehouse type situation in orphanages.
And it doesn't have to even be as extreme as orphanages. It can be experiences that are regretfully occurring in many, many parts of our country.
Often institutional care in this country is under the euphemistic name of transitional care or temporary care or assessment facilities.
If you think about what institutional or residential care would look like for an infant, where there's somebody new coming on to the shift every 8 hours, it really alters the development of the child's brain architecture and other aspects of the child's development.
We have the potential to change children's developmental trajectories.
Interventions can apply to parents, to foster parents or adoptive parents, childcare settings, Head Start settings, and other kinds of settings. And really, what they're about is attuning people to the serve and return process.
Neglecting young children is neglecting the foundations of a healthy next generation. The community pays a huge price later in terms of the problems of the next generation, whether it be educational achievement, economic productivity, good citizenship, the ability to parent the next generation. All of the things that have to do with a healthy, prosperous society.
All right, so that kind of details the different spots of neglect and where it can bring folks. As social workers, again, we are mandatory reporters, so under some of these acts, we report if we find stuff such as that. The last few child welfare legislations were the Keeping Children and Families Safe Act, Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, and then CAPTA Reauthorization Act of 2010. So this, if you open the inside of your Schoology download, this gives the years that a lot of these were pushed, mostly starting after the 1974 Child Abuse and Prevention Act. Then some of the delivery systems. So we try as social workers to the highest degree to do primary prevention. So not even having it happen in the first place. We also aim for, as you'll find out, even if you work for CPS, we try to do the family preservation. So the ultimate goal they are mostly going for is to get the family back together. Maybe it's providing daycare after we help the family get a job, or it could be family group conferencing, so doing different things, especially during coronavirus. This is now even done virtually. Also foster care, so if mom or dad has to go into addiction services temporarily or they are incarcerated, we try to have foster care, and usually they try to get it with a family member first. So if not, mom or dad's brother and sister, mom and dad's parents. So again, the grandparents raising grandchildren. Then there are residential services. That's one thing that we offered at Lighthouse Youth Services. And if there is incarceration or a death in the family, there can be ultimately adoption, that there's a permanent adoption because they see that the parent is not going to come back into the child's life for whatever reason. At all costs, we try to avoid that as social workers, but they do still want to have the child to be safe. This is a good grid you can look at to show the flow of how kids go through the process after suspected child abuse and neglect. They then get a professional or community member that reports suspected abuse. So mandated reporters are like teachers, social workers, case managers, other folks in the community. And then the report is screened in, or if it doesn't meet the criteria for abuse and neglect, it stops. But if it's screened in, then safety concerns exist and or risk is significant, or safety concerns and risk are moderate and they just kind of monitor, or there are no safety concerns and risk is low. So CPS may conduct a family assessment at that point and see that they just need to maybe get them help with food assistance or something very simple. If it's not very simple, then CPS would investigate. They try to look at the evidence of abuse or neglect, or substantiated or even founded abuse or neglect. Now, if there's insufficient evidence of abuse or neglect, it can be considered unsubstantiated or unfounded, and then the case is closed. If there is a need for community-based services or soup kitchen, food pantry, they get them there. If the child has been harmed and there's risk of future abuse, they move on to a court petition that could be filed. Sometimes there's low risk or nothing can be found and the case is closed. Sometimes the court process is started and the child stays with the family services until the child and family are safe, so the risk is minimized and the case is closed. If there's still significant risk, the child is placed in out-of-home care and services are provided to the child and the family. Then there's the hopeful family reunification part. If mom and dad had been incarcerated and they got out of jail or needed treatment and successfully completed or graduated. Sometimes, if they haven't graduated in a while, custody is given to the relative, and or there's termination of the parental rights and adoption or permanent legal guardianship occurs. And then if there's no family or relative, they'll do independent living with permanent family connections. So that's the kind of flow of how it goes through the system. Making sure the computer's still alive. We have about 6% left. So in family services, these are to preserve and strengthen families, to support parents in fulfilling their parental roles. Families have a right to raise their own children. The home-based services are family counseling, parent education, and then sometimes respite care. So we have the case managers at Lighthouse take care of that. And then occasionally there's services that augment the family functioning and support the parental roles if there's an inadequacy there. And then children have a right to develop in a healthy family relationship. That's why we do go into these in the first place. And occasionally there's parent aids. So these are things that, we try to get the family connected with and find them help with. So, there was one other video I wanted to finish with, but it was a TED Talk, just how if the trauma is addressed, showing that there is the possibility of wellness, and that it's not always, so treacherous. Sometimes it is a cry for help and showing that there's a need for the rehabilitation or incarceration. And then how to recognize some of the indicators of child abuse. So as a social worker, seeing some of these things, this is how you would recognize them.
Unfortunately, child abuse is common with a lifetime risk of about 25%. This makes child abuse more likely to occur in a child's lifetime than even common childhood diseases, such as asthma. This is a problem that you will encounter in your training and practice. There are many different types of child abuse, including exposure to domestic violence, neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. As health professionals, we must be on the lookout for child maltreatment, as it can endanger a child's survival, safety, self-esteem, growth, and development. Child abuse is not always obvious and can present in any racial, economic, and cultural background. A child may be scared to tell others about the abuse, or may not even recognize that they are being treated wrongly. Here are 5 red flags that should raise your suspicion for child abuse. 1, a story that doesn't fit. For example, injuries that are not consistent with the mechanism described, the amount of force, the age of the child, or their developmental stage. 2, inconsistent or changing history. 3, delay in seeking medical attention. 4, multiple injuries or injuries at different stages of healing. 5, pattern injuries. For example, bruising that outlines an object. In Canada and in the United States, health professionals are legally obligated to report any suspicion of child abuse. A report can be made by contacting your local child protection agency or a state's child abuse reporting hotline. Investigation and treatment of possible child abuse is dependent on the type of abuse that is suspected. In most cases, referral to a regional child abuse program is warranted. It is important to remember that you do not need to be certain that abuse has occurred. You will almost never be certain. If you have any suspicion or reason to believe abuse is occurring, you must report.
All right, that's an important thing to finish with. So we don't have to investigate the abuse. Sometimes
Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about physical abuse and
we just have to report it and allow the different agencies to do the investigation. So that was one relief as a social worker I found, is that if you call, and in Cincinnati the number is 241-KIDS. When you report it, you are not responsible to do anything else after that. They will report what is necessary. And that's helpful for me to know, because you think you'd have to come up with evidence, you think you would have to come up with details, and you actually don't. So as you can see how many videos there are about child abuse and neglect, some people give their own personal story about it. So my abuse story, and different folks that had struggled and dealt with gaslighting or getting counseling with domestic abuse. So if this is an area you would like to go into, I would definitely look into some of these videos and, look at the brain development, look at the things that come up as the childhood is progressing. And even the one, some of the cartoon ones are helpful, like 14 subtle things that abusive parents can do. And this,
When it comes to abusive parents, what comes to your mind? You think of physical, mental, and sexual abuse? Parents can be abusive in ways that are hard to detect. It doesn't matter how the parents express it though. Abuse is abuse, no matter what. Long-term abuse will increase the chances of developing serious mental health problems that will be dragged into adulthood. Different forms of abuse will affect children in numerous ways. Curious to know more? Here are 15 subtle things an abusive parent can do to their children. 1. Little to no privacy. There's a huge difference between a parent protecting their child from harm versus giving them a lack of privacy. It's essential for parents to provide age-appropriate privacy to their children, such as allowing them to change alone in their room. 2. Invalidating emotions and reality. Parents can invalidate their children's feelings by telling them how to feel, or completely denying their feelings altogether. This makes children feel unheard and internally conflicted. In the long run, children will have difficulties trusting their judgment and making decisions. 3. Giving the silent treatment. It's an immature way of handling things, and it's emotionally abusive. Parents use this tactic to exert their power or punish their children. Due to this, the children feel unheard, rejected, and develop low self-esteem. 4. Playing the victim card. This type of behavior is emotionally abusive because the parent doesn't take responsibility for their actions. This in turn can affect children in 2 ways. They can learn this type of behavior and use it as a coping mechanism when they're older, or develop feelings of guilt and shame and blame themselves for things that they shouldn't. 5. Gaslighting. This is a type of psychological abuse, and it's difficult to detect. It's a type of manipulation where the abuser creates doubt and confusion within the victim. A parent who gaslights their children will leave them feeling insecure, paranoid, anxious, and mistrusting. In extreme cases, the child will end up questioning their reality. 6. Threats of violence. It's emotionally abusive for parents to threaten their child with physical violence, even if they aren't going to use it. Children end up feeling unsafe around their parents and don't want to be home. 7.
So if you want to watch the other half of those, I see we're coming close towards the end. about 3 till, and the computer is going to die. So lots of videos on the different, the next one of examples of tricky families. Was I abused? Childhood PTSD info and test. So you can take a test and just, as a social worker, going through that healing so we don't pass that on to children of our own. So with that, remember to email any questions you have, and have a good week.